By noon, they had collected over $3,000 in parking fees on my land. By 4 in the afternoon, every single car that had paid those fees was being put to a tow truck.
You had no right to touch it!
And the HOA president was standing in the middle of my feed, watching it happen with the expression of a man who had just realized the most expensive mistake of his life was occurring in real time, and there was nothing left to do but watch. My name is Anderson Briggs, and I am 62 years old. And I am a retired commercial real estate attorney who spent 30 years in Charleston, South Carolina, practicing property law before I bought 106 acres outside Greenville, in upstate South Carolina, in Greenville County.
Look, I don't
decided
care
the
what
most valuable thing I could do, like legal knowledge I had accumulated over 3 decades, was absolutely nothing professional with it ever again. I told you this was a bad idea. I grow hay on the front 60 acres and lease the back 40 to a neighboring cattle farmer. And I live in a farmhouse that was built in 1951 and has good bones and drafty windows and a front porch that faces western, catches the late afternoon light, in a way that I consider adequate compensation for every difficult thing that has ever happened to me. I am telling you my background up front, because it is the reason this story ended the way it did. A retired commercial real estate attorney who spent 30 years in property law does not discover that someone is charging parking fees on his land and wonder what his options are. He already knows exactly what his options are. He has known for 30 years. And on a Saturday morning in September, when I drove past my front hayfield on the way back from the feed store and saw orange traffic cones and a hand-painted sign reading parking $20 and a man in a yellow, thus collecting cash from a line of cars turning into my field, I did not wonder about my options at all. I simply started executing them in the order that made the most sense. The Palmetto Ridge Community Association governed the development of 194 homes that sat on the land directly east of my property in Greenville County. It had been built in phases between 2013 and 2018 and shared my eastern fence line for approximately a quarter mile along the boundary where my hayfield met their development's western edge. For the first 5 years of their existence, the HOA and I had coexisted without incident, in the way that a working farm and a residential development can coexist when everyone understands where the line is and respects it. I had never had a formal dispute with them and had exchanged nothing more than occasional waves with residents who walked the path along their side of the fence line. In the evenings, the HOA president was a man named Victor Slade, who was 55 years old and who had been in the position for 2 years. And who operated the association with the specific philosophy that revenue generation and community enhancement were interchangeable concepts that justified each other without requiring separate justification. Victor had a background in hospitality management, which meant he understood how to monetize space and traffic, and he looked at the open land around his community the way a hotel manager looks at an empty conference room, which was as an opportunity that was being wasted by not being booked. What Victor had identified was a regional craft fair and outdoor market called the Upstate Harvest Festival that drew approximately 4,000 visitors annually to a fairground location about 2 miles from my property, and that had been experiencing a parking shortage for 3 years as attendance had grown beyond the fairground's capacity. Victor had apparently approached the festival organizers with a proposal to use adjacent private land as overflow parking at $20 per vehicle, and the festival organizers had accepted because they needed the capacity, and Victor had presented himself as someone with authority over the relevant land, which was my hayfield and my property, and my land that Victor had no authority over whatsoever. I do not know exactly when Victor decided that my field was available for his parking operation. What I know is that I left my property at 8 in the morning on that Saturday to drive to the feed store. And my field was empty, and when I came back at 10:15, there were approximately 80 cars parked in my hayfield, in organized rules guided by orange cones, and the second line of vehicles waiting to enter from the county road, and a man in a yellow vest collecting $20 bills at a folding table set up just inside my field entrance, where my gate had been propped open with a concrete block. I sat in my truck at the county road for about 30 seconds, looking at all of this, and then I pulled forward and parked on the road shoulder and got out and walked to the man in the yellow vest. He was in his 30s and had the cheerful efficiency of someone who was having a productive morning, and I asked who had authorized this parking operation on this field, and he told me the Palmetto Ridge HOA had arranged it with the landowner, and that it was all properly set up. I told him I was the landowner, and I had not arranged anything with anyone, and he looked at me with the uncertainty of a man who has just received information that does not fit the framework he has been operating in all morning, and I told him calmly to stop collecting money and to call whoever had hired him immediately. Then I walked back to my truck and called my former law partner in Charleston, a man named Gerald Oates who still practiced and who I trusted more than anyone I had ever worked with professionally. Gerald answered on the second ring, and I described what I was looking at. And he was quiet for a moment. And then he said, "Anderson, you know exactly what to do here." And I said, "I do. And I just wanted to hear your voice before I started." And he laughed and told me to call him when it was done. I want to tell you what I did next in what order because the sequence matters, and it is the part of the story that reflects 30 years of knowing how property law actually works when someone decides to use your land for commercial purposes without your permission. The first call was to the Greenville County Sheriff's Office, where I reported an unauthorized commercial operation being conducted on my private property. The second call was to a towing company I had used before, named Upstate Recovery, and I described the situation and asked whether they could have multiple units at my property within 2 hours, and the owner said he could have 4 trucks there by 1 in the afternoon. The third call was to a licensed appraiser named Dennis Ford, who I had worked with during my practicing years, and who I asked to be at my property by 2 in the afternoon to document the condition of my hayfield, with a formal assessment of any damage caused by vehicle traffic. And I told him to photograph everything thoroughly. The fourth call was to Victor Slade, whose number I had found on the HOA's public website, and who answered with the brisk confidence of a man managing a successful event. I introduced myself as the owner of the field this parking operation was using, and I gave him exactly one opportunity to handle the situation correctly, which was to immediately cease all parking operations, remove all vehicles from my field, restore my gate to its normal position, and present himself at my property within the hour to discuss restitution. I told him I had already contacted the sheriff's office and the towing company and an appraiser, and that the next 30 minutes represented his window to get ahead of what was coming, rather than be buried by it. He told me there had clearly been a miscommunication and that he was sure we could work it out. And I told him the window was 30 minutes and ended the call. Victor did not appear at my property within 30 minutes. What he did instead, based on the sequence of events that followed, was called the festival organizers and try to manage the situation from a distance, which is what people do when they have made a significant mistake and have convinced themselves that phone calls can contain it. They cannot contain it when the sheriff is already on the way, and the tow trucks have been dispatched, and the property owner is standing at the gate of his own field with 30 years of property law and is hit and nothing else to do on a Saturday afternoon. The first sheriff's deputy arrived at 11:40, and I met him at the road and walked him through the situation with the completeness and deficiency of someone who has prepared witnesses for depositions for 3 decades. I had my deed on my phone, and I had a photograph of my gate in its normal closed position, taking the previous Tuesday when I had done my regular fence check. And I had the screenshot of the HOA's event page that I had found while making my calls, which showed the parking operation, advertised under the Palmetto Ridge Community Association's brand, with a map that clearly showed my field, labeled as overflow parking for the Upstate Harvest Festival. The deputy looked at all of it and made notes and walked the field perimeter and spoke briefly with the man in the yellow vest, who confirmed again that he had been hired by the HOA and gave the deputy Victor's name and contact information. The deputy called Victor, and that conversation, from what the deputy told me afterward, was brief and conclusive. To had acknowledged that he had arranged the parking operation and that he had believed he had authority to use the adjacent field, and had acknowledged when pressed that he did not have a signed agreement with the field's owner and could not produce documentation of any permission having been granted. The deputy told me that absent a signed agreement, the operation constituted criminal trespass under South Carolina law, and that he was going to issue a warning to the man in the yellow vest to cease operations immediately, and that any further collection of fees after that warning would result in a citation. Cash collection stopped at 12:17. By that point, 1 of 14 vehicles were parked in my hayfield, and the festival organizers were directing additional overflow traffic to a backup location they had scrambled to arrange, and the field entrance had been closed, and the concrete block removed from my gate, which I locked with my own padlock.